I have a question for you to start out with, and this is a rhetorical question. Don't all shout your answers at once. Just think about this. But my question is a simple question: Are you deceived? Are you deceived? Let's pray. Father, this is not an intellectual exercise tonight. We want to say spiritual things to spiritual men, and I ask, Lord, that you would walk among us, that you would lead me with your Spirit, that you would anoint this place and be with us, and that you would open our eyes tonight, and that we would just hear what you have to say. And I ask it in the name of Jesus. Amen. I want to start with a couple of Bible verses, and I've had too much college, I admit that. So that's your backdrop for this. This is Colossians 2:8. See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, which are based on human traditions and the spiritual forces of the world, rather than on Christ. And it's got a word in there that I've spent a lot of time. I like philosophy. I like studying philosophy. And I also like Greek. I like going back. I don't feel like there's a perfect translation. I like going back and seeing as close as I can what it said in the original. I tell a joke and tell people I know a little Greek. He owns a delicatessen down, but I can't read the stuff. I can't speak it, but I can research. So let's look at this next slide. It says, "See to it." In the King James, it says, "Take heed that no one takes you captive through philosophy." Now the Greek words there, philo, is love. It's brotherly love. It's Philadelphia. It's a very strong bond, and sophos is wisdom. And we get the English word sophisticated, I think, out of that. Wisdom had been around a long time with Solomon and with Job and people like that before philosophy ever developed. But it's the love of wisdom. And I like to say it's the love of godless wisdom, because we'll talk about that as we go on. And empty deception, which are based on human traditions and the spiritual forces. Stoicia. Stoicia is very difficult to translate. The translators, almost every version comes up with something different. Elemental spirits in the English Standard Version, elemental principles in the New American Standard, rudiments in the King James. It's clear that there's something spiritual about this, but it's not necessarily personified in the form of demons or powers or principalities. I don't know what to tell you it is, but there's this spiritual idea underneath all of this. I'm going to back up and say, which are based on human traditions and the spiritual forces of the world. And the Greek word there is cosmos. And when I started looking at the texts I have here, the translations of the various Greek words that get translated into English as world were fascinating to me. Cosmos here is universe. It's a place. So these elemental spirits are tied to a place, and they are not Christ, rather than Christ. Everybody knows Romans 2:12, and I mean 12:2, and I just find it interesting because it has to do with the way we think. Do not be conformed to the pattern, suskimazito. Scheme is an English word that comes out of that. Don't be conformed to the scheme of this world. And we get a different Greek word here for world, and it has to do, we get the English word eon, age, period of time, from this. So in the last verse, world was a place, and in this verse, world is a period of time. I think they're tied together, but I just think that's interesting. By the renewing of your mind, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. So we started out with something taking us captive. And we come here to this verse, and it talks about us taking ideas captive. And That's big enough for you guys to see. I was afraid that would be too small. For we do not walk in the world. The King James says, walk in the flesh. And so here we have another way that the modern idea of world gets translated from the Greek. We have a place, we have a time, and now we have our physical presence all being tied together in the idea that we think of as world. We do not wage war as the world does. We do not wage war after the flesh. The weapons we fight with are not weapons of the world, of the flesh. On the contrary, they have divine power, dinata. And that word gets translated almost every place else in the New Testament as possible when Jesus says all things are dinata. These are divine possibilities. They have divine possibilities to demolish strongholds. And the word there, you picture a fortress, but it can also be a prison. We demolish arguments, logimos, which is a thought. And it comes from logimia, which is to reckon or to calculate. And it goes on back to the Greek word logos. In the beginning, first chapter of John, in the beginning was the Logos. And the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And the Logos was made flesh and dwelt among us. And this was a very important Greek philosophical word. It was the idea, the concept, the solution. It was very difficult to bring down into a single capsule. And so we have the idea, we have the logic, we have however you want to put that. We demolish arguments and every pretension, I won't say the Greek word there, but it's an abstract that sets itself up. I go back to the idea that there are spiritual forces at work here. These things are alive. These ideas have a life of their own. They set themselves up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. That's the end of my Bible verses. And the idea that I want to try and get across here is that whether you're used to it or not, and our society discourages it, whether you're used to it or not, sometimes you have to think about it. You have to sit there and struggle mentally to say, what is it that I believe? What am I being told? You have to reflect and pick apart what you're being confronted with in the society around you. And if you believe a lie, you empower the liar. If you believe a lie, you empower the liar. So I want to ask again, are you deceived? And how would you know if you were deceived? Because my first answer when I saw that question was, I'm not deceived. I'm a smart person. Why would I be deceived? That's silly. I'm not deceived. Am I? I don't think I'm deceived. Maybe I'm deceived. Am I deceived? Okay. I'm a teacher. And I'm certified to teach reading. I've worked with first graders, second graders. We teach something we call metacognition. You don't have to remember that word. But you know what cognition is, thinking. We teach kids to think about their thinking. Now, Johnny, who was the character that started out this story that's not in this scene anymore? Do you remember that? Oh, that was Bob, wasn't it? What did he do with that, Bob? Now I understand the story. And you have to monitor your own thinking as you go through stuff and say, what happened about this yesterday? What were my conclusions then? What is it that, and we don't do enough of that. It's a struggle. We don't do enough of that. We don't reflect on what we believe. We don't reflect on our own thinking. I'm going to say another big, long psychological word that I learned from being in college too long and being a teacher. It's cognitive dissonance. Dissonance is noise. It's when two sounds don't go together. If I go up on the keyboard and I play a C chord with one hand and a G chord with another, people say, stop that. No, don't do that. That's dissonance. Cognitive dissonance in your brain, it's when you believe two different things at the same time and know they can't both be true. But you're stuck with them and you don't know which one's true and which one's not and how to. You walk around hanging this little I love Dilbert, and he says, this is the boss sitting here, and he says, if your numbers are correct, my strategic plan is irrational. And then you hear this little noise, and says cognitive dissonance takes over. And the boss says, "You sure are bad with numbers." You know, and Dilbert says, "What was that noise?" There's another good example of cognitive dissonance. Sorry to bring a picture of a bar in here to church, but, you know. Two guys sitting here, you know, and one of them says, "She likes me, but she's playing hard to get." He has these ideas about himself. He can see what she's doing. Cognitive dissonance. I can't accept the fact that she doesn't like me. If I just wait a little while, she likes me. She's just playing hard to get. How do we reconcile two ideas that don't fit together? I want to take you on a walk through philosophy and just spend a couple of minutes talking about what philosophers taught. And you tell me if these ideas affect you today. You tell me if these ideas creep into your life today. And the first one is a guy by the name of Thales. Thales was the first person to be called a philosopher. Thales was surrounded by Greek religion, and to be perfectly fair to him, Greek religion was full of orgies and drunkenness and gods who acted like people do, and people act bad, you know. So he didn't see understanding the world as something that he could just go to the gods and say, "Hey, when y'all sober up, will you tell me what's going on here?" So he decided that you could understand the world without divine help. If you go out and you look around and you think about what's going on around you, you can get it. Do you believe that? I don't. I don't believe that you can. I work with kids. I see kids. I come in and I see a kid, and he's being a brat today. And I'm tempted to say, he's a brat. He's being a brat. Is he a brat? When I know that if I pray and say, "God, what's going on here?" something different than that might be revealed to me. And that I don't have the resources to figure out on my own what's going on in a child's heart. I do not believe that this guy is the founder of modern science in the sense that he was the first person in Western civilization to say, you can go out and just take notes and figure the world out on your own. Just go observe. Next. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, in that order. People don't understand how close Socrates and Plato were. They walked right up to the edge of the cliff in terms of knowing God. They believed they were the first people to begin to articulate monotheism. They gave lip service to Zeus and Apollo and Poseidon and all of that, but they believed there was one God, one divine being out there. They believed he was good. And they believed that he was the giver of knowledge and that knowledge was good. And it is. Knowledge is a good thing. And so they decided to seek knowledge. They sought his hand and not his face. They got that close. And today, it's not the information age, it's not the last 20 years that have affected your life. We have better tools now. But Western society for 2,500 years has had a thirst of knowledge, a thirst for knowledge because of Socrates and Plato. You want to know. You want to know what the weather's going to be on Thursday. You want to know where your neighbors went on vacation. You want to know about politics in foreign countries. You want to know about the national budgets. You want to know whether Tom Brady really let the air out of those footballs. You want to know what was in Hillary's emails, and you want to know whether Donald's hair is real. You want to know. And you can thank Socrates and Plato for that. Aristotle, if anybody's ever told you to think outside the box, Aristotle built the box. From Socrates and Plato, Aristotle went on out and he began to catalog the world around him. And he began to put things in categories and boxes, and he really liked binary ideas. He wanted two extremes, yes or no, big or little, hot or cold, round or square. He wanted these binary categories, and he carried it on over into morality. He came up with moral categories, and everything with Aristotle became about the extent to which it was either good or bad. And we carry that over, and it follows us around. When the truth is, and I should stop here and talk about the way that the philosophers came up with ethics, was that first they stepped over here and they built a metaphysical framework. They said this is what the world is like. And then once they had their world, they would step over here and say, now based on that world, what can I infer about morality and ethics? My morality, my ethics is based on the idea that my world includes a supreme being and was built and shaped by him. And my morality then is based on what I know about him. Aristotle couldn't say that. And instead of saying, is it good or bad, I look at it and I think of four moral categories. And most people can't tell you these four moral, they'll say, oh yeah, but they don't have them in their head following them around. The first is, God commands it. I relate to a person in terms of morality, and that person says, you must. The second is, God forbids it. You may not. You must, you may not. Then there's God encourages it. You should give. It would be really nice if you would give to the poor. And then the fourth one is, yeah, that's okay, you can. The Jews have a word for it. They say kosher. Can I eat that? Well, yeah, I ain't eating it. But you can eat it if you want to. It's allowed. Things that are allowed, things that are encouraged, things that are forbidden, things that are commanded. Those, to me, and Aristotle has us down to, just tell me, is sugar good or bad? And my response is, well, it's allowed. That's what you want. Go for it. Epicurus is the picture up here now. Epicurus was a philosopher at about this same time. And Epicurus was a materialist and a hedonist. And my school system just gave out bracelets to teenage kids, little rubber bracelets that had a slogan that originates in Epicurus's philosophy. The bracelets all said YOLO on them, because Epicurus believed you only live once, and you should make the most of it. Now, when I say he was a materialist, it's not real if you can't experience it with your senses. That's what he thought. And he was a hedonist. He sought pleasure. Now, let me tell you, this is a man who died of his own kidney stones and lived the life of a vegetarian. His idea of pleasure was the absence of pain. If you've ever had kidney stones, that's not a bad definition of pleasure. Pleasure is not having kidney stones right now. And so he wasn't seeking after ecstasy, but to him, life was about pleasure, and, you know, if you went to too much of an extreme, it would short-circuit the process, so he believed in moderation. You only live once. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Seneca was somebody who might have actually met the Apostle Paul. Seneca was a senator in the Roman Senate, and he was in Rome when Paul was imprisoned. And he was one of the early people who made the Stoic philosophy the most popular. And the Stoics taught to the public. Stoic is a play on the Greek word for porch. They would teach out on the porch in public for people to come listen. And Stoicism kind of summed up and it was eclectic. It took bits and pieces of all the philosophies. And the problem that we experience today is that Stoicism is still around. I'm going to tell you the basic tenets of Stoicism, and it's broad. There's some flexibility involved. But number one is be reasonable, by which they mean follow reason, follow logic, just what makes sense. Let's talk about what makes sense. People are basically good, or at least they have the potential within them to be good. You should avoid emotional upset. The Stoics believe that when life treats you badly, that really your problem is not that life treated you badly, because let's face it, that's predictable. The problem is you were unprepared for it. And so just prepare yourself, brace yourself. One of the steps toward bracing yourself that they taught was that you should figure out what the worst thing that could happen today is. And at the end of the day, be grateful that it wasn't as bad as it could be. And that gets incorporated today into psychological therapies. There are people using those principles in modern professional care for people. The last one that is that the key to happiness is your own virtue. You can be a good person. If you struggle to be a good person, if you try and be a good person, you can be a good person. And if you're a good person, you'll be happy. Do any of those sound familiar? Have any of those made it into society today? Marcus Aurelius. Anybody here seen the movie Gladiator? He's the guy that gets smothered with the pillow early on. He was a Roman emperor. I had to read his Meditations in college. Marcus Aurelius was the height of that. Part of the power of Seneca was that in about the 3rd century A.D., there appeared these letters that looked like they were an exchange of letters between the Apostle Paul and Seneca. And it was well over 1,000 years before somebody decided they were a fraud. I think John Calvin himself was involved in deciding that these were fraudulent. But for 1,000 years, Christians believed that Stoicism had a relationship with Christianity in the day of Paul. And that lie made it in many ways into the church. Lies. I'm going to conclude by telling you 5 lies. And I could tell you 10, I could tell you 20. We'd be here all night. But I'm going to tell you my 5 favorite lies. And you should recognize them as lies. And you should have an answer for them. The first one here, Epicurus said, if God is willing to prevent evil, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Where does evil, whence comes evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? And the lie is, evil in the world is God's fault. And you will hear that lie. Why has God done this to me? It's usually in the form of a question. Why has God done this to me? And the answer is, evil is in the world because of man. When he asks, where does evil come from? He means that to be rhetorical. And I have an answer. The answer is, God tolerates the evil we create so that more of us can come to him. It's not his fault, it's our fault. Lie number 2, you only live once. Hebrews says it is appointed unto to men to die once, and then, if I stop right there and at the end then, does that sound like you only live once? The question is not whether you live more than once. The question is whether you die more than once. I'm going to die. Am I going to die the second time? Am I going to face the second death? And that's the message that we have to talk about with society. My third lie, everything happens for a reason. Well, you know, everything happens for a reason. Sometimes the reason is summed up here in Ezekiel 22:30. I looked for someone among them who would build up the wall and stand before me in the gap on behalf of the land, so I would not have to destroy it, but I found no one. Sometimes the reason things happen is because God can't find a Christian to step up and say, we will not do that. That is not happening here. I held a woman's hand at school a couple of days ago and prayed for her. Her husband, who she's been with since she was 14, asked her for a divorce. And later that day, the county that she lives in contacted her and told her that last year nobody paid her property tax and that she had 30 days to come up with $2,000 or they were going to auction the house out from under her 12 and 16-year-old kid. And she cried and she told me that she felt like that Satan was going to destroy her and that this all started when she stopped going to church. And I said, well, why don't you go back to church? But we're going to put a hedge about you. And we prayed against those things. And we said, no, that's not going to happen. And when we finished praying, she said, I just feel like Satan. And I said, we just put a stop to that. Don't say that again. Because we believe that. Things happen because we don't stop it. He's a good guy. People are basically good. The lie of virtue, the Stoic lie of virtue. Well, that's horse hockey. He's not a good guy. I've read Romans 3. There is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one that understands. There is no one who seeks God. They have all turned away. I could go on. I won't read to you. He is not a good guy. He's not. Neither am I. Except for the grace of God, I'd be laying in some pig pen someplace, probably wrapped right up next to the pig trying to stay warm. Last one. This is my favorite lie. You know, it is what it is. It is what it is. And when somebody tells me it is what it is, I look at them and I think, you know, I serve a God who gives life to the dead and calls things that are not as though they were. And it is not what it is. It is what you have the faith to make it. It is you standing there looking at it saying, is this what God wants it to be? Can I hear God in this? Do I hear a voice telling me, step out and change this? Because it is not what it is. There are more with us than are with them, whatever Bible story you want to take. It is not what it is unless we leave it lay there. I said I could go on with 10, 15 more lies. I could also go on into modern philosophy and do this whole thing again and start with Descartes and talk to you about Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus and the people who have messed up modern life so much. Not tonight. Thank you.